My family thought they were voting me out of their lives. They had no idea I was about to bring the ghost of our past back to life. The air at our annual family reunion always hung thick and heavy, a humid cocktail of cheap charcoal, freshly cut grass, and decades of unspoken resentment. This year, however, there was a new ingredient in the mix: judgment. And it was all aimed directly at me. I could feel it from the moment I pulled my beat-up sedan onto the lawn behind a row of gleaming SUVs. The whispers would stop just as I got within earshot. The smiles would tighten, and the conversation would awkwardly pivot to the weather or Grandma Matilda's prize-winning petunias. It was like walking through a minefield of fake pleasantries, each one a potential trigger for the explosion I knew was coming. My crime? I had refused to be suffocated by the family legacy. Our family owned Henderson & Sons Hardware, a business my great-grandfather started with a hammer and a handful of nails. It had provided a solid, respectable, but utterly predictable life for 3 generations. My father, God rest his soul, had been the heart of the operation. He loved the smell of sawdust and the quiet satisfaction of helping someone find the right kind of screw. When he passed away 2 years ago, he left his 51% controlling interest in the business to me. The rest of the family, my Aunt Carol, my Uncle Robert, and their various offspring owned the other 49%, and they were furious. They expected me to step into my father's steel-toed boots, to spend the rest of my life behind the counter, breathing in the dust of the past. But I had a different dream. I was a software developer. I saw a future in code, not in carriage bolts. Using the inheritance my father left me personally, not the business shares, I co-founded a small tech startup. To my family, this was tantamount to treason. I was, in Aunt Carol's venomous words, pissing away my father's legacy on a childish fantasy. They had offered to buy me out of the business at a price that was frankly insulting, so they could have full control. I refused. That business was the last real piece of my dad I had left, and I wasn't letting it go. Not like that. My refusal was the final straw. The intervention, because that's what it was, happened just after the potato salad had turned lukewarm. Aunt Carol, a woman whose pursed lips could probably cut glass, clapped her hands together with a sharp, commanding crack. "Everyone, can we gather in the living room, please? We need to have a family discussion." The tone was sickly sweet, the kind of sweetness that precedes a dose of poison. The apathetic teenagers were herded off their phones, the uncles paused their debate about property taxes, and everyone shuffled into the house. The air conditioning hummed, fighting a losing battle against the body heat and the palpable tension. I was maneuvered into a rickety wooden chair in the center of the room, feeling less like a guest and more like a defendant at an inquisition. My cousin Mark, the family's golden boy with a cushy middle management job and a smug grin, stood beside his mother, Carol. He was the one who started. "Look, Alex," he began, his voice dripping with condescension. "We all love you. You know that. But we're worried. This little computer game company of yours is failing. You're burning through your father's hard-earned money, and you're dragging the Henderson name through the mud by refusing to be a part of the family business." I gritted my teeth. "It's not a game company, Mark. It's a logistics software startup. And we're not failing. We just secured our second round of seed funding." Aunt Carol scoffed, a sound like a deflating tire. "Seed funding? Alex, listen to yourself. You're speaking gibberish. Your father built something real, something tangible. You could have a secure future, a respected place in this community. Instead, you choose to play with imaginary money in a dark room somewhere." I looked around the room, searching for an ally. My Uncle Robert stared intently at his shoes. My cousins fidgeted, avoiding my gaze. Even Grandma Matilda, the matriarch who usually had a soft spot for me, looked at me with an expression of profound disappointment. Her silence was the most damning of all. They had all been poisoned against me. They saw my ambition as an insult, my independence as a betrayal. I tried to reason with them. I explained my business model, the projections, the passion I had for what I was building. I reminded them that my father had always told me to follow my own path, not his. Dad wanted me to be happy, I pleaded, my voice cracking slightly. He would have understood this. He would have been proud. That was the wrong thing to say. Aunt Carol's face hardened. "Don't you dare presume to know what your father would have wanted," she snapped. "My brother was a practical man. He would be heartbroken to see you throwing everything away. We have given you a chance to do the right thing, to sell us your shares so we can protect the business. You've refused. You've left us no choice." She took a deep breath, puffing out her chest like a self-important pigeon. "We need to protect the family. From you." I felt a cold dread creep up my spine. "What are you talking about?" Carol exchanged a look with Mark, who nodded grimly. "We've decided to hold a vote," she announced to the silent, captive audience. "A vote to formally sever all ties. No more financial support, no more family holidays, no more contact, until you come to your senses, dissolve this ridiculous company, and agree to sell your father's shares back to the family, where they belong." My heart hammered against my ribs. This couldn't be happening. This was a family, not a corporate board meeting. "You can't be serious," I whispered, the words getting lost in the oppressive quiet. "We are perfectly serious, Alex," Carol said, her voice cold and final. "We are doing this for your own good and for the good of this family. So, all in favor of the motion?" And then it happened. Slowly, deliberately, my Uncle Robert raised his hand, then my cousin Sarah, then another and another. It was a silent, brutal cascade of betrayal. Mark's hand shot up instantly, a triumphant smirk on his face. I scanned the room, my vision blurring, my breath catching in my throat. I saw hands of people who had changed my diapers, taught me to ride a bike, and cheered at my high school graduation, all raised against me. My gaze finally landed on Grandma Matilda. She looked at me, her ancient eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful resignation, and then, with a trembling that broke my heart, her hand went up too. The vote was unanimous, and in that suffocating silence, surrounded by the only family I had ever known, I had never felt so completely and utterly alone. The silence in the room was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest and stealing the air from my lungs. One by one, the hands came down. Some were hesitant, others defiant, but they had all been raised. My family. They had just surgically removed me from their lives with a simple show of hands. My vision tunneled, focusing on Aunt Carol's triumphant face. She looked like a Roman emperor who had just sentenced a gladiator to death. She thought she was saving the family empire. All I saw was a woman drunk on her own petty power. A sound escaped my throat. It started as a choked gasp but twisted into a dry, humorless laugh. It was a horrible, ragged sound that echoed in the suddenly too quiet room. "You voted," I said, the words feeling foreign in my mouth. "You actually held a vote to disown me." "It's not a disownment, Alex," Aunt Carol said, her voice a soothing balm of condescension that only made my skin crawl. "It's a temporary separation, a wake-up call. We love you, and that's why we have to do this. Tough love." "Tough love?" I repeated, my voice rising. I pushed myself up from the rickety chair, my legs shaking but my spine rigid. "Don't you dare dress this up as anything other than what it is. This isn't about love. This is about control. It has always been about control. You couldn't stand that Dad gave me the controlling shares. You couldn't stand that I had a dream that didn't involve stocking shelves and counting washers for the rest of my life." I swept my gaze across the room, landing on each of them. "You want to talk about my father's legacy? His legacy was telling me to be my own man, to build something for myself. Something you've all been too afraid to do, hiding in the shadow of a hardware store that hasn't changed its inventory since 1985. A collective gasp went through the room. My cousin Sarah clutched her pearls as if I'd just cursed in church. "That's enough." Uncle Robert finally spoke, his voice thick with a mixture of anger and shame. "You're being disrespectful." "Disrespectful?" I shot back, the last thread of my restraint snapping. "You just voted to treat me like a stranger, and you're worried about my tone. This is a hostile takeover disguised as a family intervention." Aunt Carol stepped forward, her eyes blazing with a righteous fury that felt ancient and deep. "We are trying to save this family from the same mistake that ruined my other brother. We will not stand by and watch another promising young Henderson throw his life away on foolish fantasies. We will not lose another one." The mention of her other brother sent a strange ripple through the room. A flicker of something uncomfortable passed between my aunt and grandmother. They were talking about Uncle Arthur, my father's younger brother, the family ghost. The story I'd always been told was that he was a drifter, a free spirit who couldn't handle responsibility. He'd had a falling out with my grandfather decades ago, took a small payout, and vanished. The family narrative was that he died penniless and alone in some forgotten corner of the country years ago. He was the cautionary tale, the specter they invoked whenever one of the younger generation stepped out of line. "Don't you bring Uncle Arthur into this?" I snarled, feeling a protective surge for the uncle I'd never known. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, I think I do," Carol said, her lips thinning into a bloodless line. "Now, I think it's time for you to go, Alex. When you're ready to be a Henderson again, you know where to find us. Mark, please show your cousin out." Mark, ever the dutiful son, puffed out his chest and stepped towards me. "Come on, Alex, let's not make this any harder than it has to be." He placed a hand on my shoulder. I flinched away from his touch as if I'd been burned. "Don't touch me," I said, my voice dangerously low. "I can find my own way out." I turned my back on them all. I didn't look at my grandmother's tear-filled eyes or my uncle's downcast face. I walked through the living room, past the family photos on the mantelpiece, generations of Hendersons smiling for the camera, a gallery of happy lies. The walk to the front door felt like a mile. I could feel every pair of eyes on my back, a searing heat of judgment and pity. Mark followed me, a silent, smug guard, ensuring the exile was completed. He opened the front door for me, the bright afternoon sun a harsh, unwelcome shock. "The offer still stands, Alex," he said quietly, as if he were doing me a favor. "When your little project goes bust, we'll still buy your shares. The price will probably be lower then, of course." I just stared at him, my heart a cold, hard stone in my chest. I didn't have any words left. I stepped out onto the porch, the door clicking shut behind me with an air of finality. The sound of the party inside started up again almost immediately. A murmur of conversation and then a burst of forced laughter. They were already moving on, erasing me. I stood there on the lawn, the smell of barbecue and betrayal thick in the air, my world crumbling around me. As I turned to walk towards my car, my footfalls silent on the soft grass, the living room window was slightly ajar. A panicked, hushed voice drifted out Uncle Robert's. "Carol? Are you sure this was the right way to handle it?" he whispered urgently. "He's stubborn, just like his father. What if he never agrees? If we can't get control of his shares to use as collateral, the bank will never approve the new loan. We're completely out of time." The words hung in the humid summer air long after I'd retreated to the relative safety of my car. Collateral, new loan, out of time. It was like finding the key to a cipher. Suddenly, the last 2 years of slights, passive-aggressive comments, and lowball offers clicked into place. This wasn't about my father's legacy or their concern for my future. It was a desperate, ugly cash grab. The family business, the sacred institution they accused me of disrespecting, was sinking. And they were trying to chain my inheritance to it like an anchor to drag it down to the bottom with them. I slammed my palm against the steering wheel, the horn letting out a pathetic, muffled bleat. The sound was swallowed by the chirping of crickets and the distant, tinny music from the party. They were in there, eating my grandmother's pie and congratulating each other on their strength and unity while they plotted to fleece me. The pain of the betrayal was still there, a raw, open wound, but now it was cauterized by a hot, cleansing fire of pure rage. They didn't just vote me off the island, they were trying to sink my lifeboat on the way out. The drive home was a blur. The familiar streets of my hometown looked alien, tainted by the day's events. Every picket fence seemed like a prison bar, every manicured lawn a facade hiding dysfunction. My startup wasn't some childish fantasy, as Aunt Carol had called it. It was my future. My team and I had bled for it, worked 18-hour days fueled by cheap coffee and a shared belief that we were building something meaningful. And my family, in their ignorance and desperation, saw it as nothing more than an obstacle. When I got back to my small apartment, the silence was deafening. I paced the floor, my mind racing. What kind of trouble were they in? Henderson & Sons was a local institution, as reliable and unchanging as the town clock. Or so I thought. My father had run it meticulously. He wasn't a flashy businessman, but he was shrewd and conservative. He would never have let the company get into a position where it needed a desperate loan. So what had changed in the 2 years since he'd been gone? Uncle Robert had taken over the day-to-day operations, with Mark as his second-in-command. The thought of their combined business acumen running the show sent a chill down my spine. Robert was a follower, not a leader, and Mark's ambition far outstripped his competence. I had to know. I couldn't just sit here and let them swindle me out of my father's legacy under the guise of family concern. As the majority shareholder, I had every right to see the company's financials, but asking for them now would raise alarms. They would stonewall me, cook the books, hide whatever it was they were so desperate to conceal. No, I had to get them myself. My dad had given me a key to the store years ago. "Just in case of emergencies," he'd said with a wink. I never had a reason to use it. I rooted through the junk drawer in my kitchen, my heart pounding, past old batteries and rubber bands until my fingers closed around the cold, familiar brass. This definitely qualified as an emergency. I waited until well after midnight. The town was asleep, the streets empty under the pale glow of the streetlights. I parked my car a block away and walked, the key sweating in my palm. The hardware store looked like a relic in the darkness, its large display windows reflecting the empty street. It felt like breaking into my own home. The key slid into the lock with a familiar click. The air inside was stale, thick with the scent of metal, oil, and sawdust. It was the smell of my childhood, but tonight it felt suffocating. I flicked on the small flashlight on my phone, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, and made my way to the back office. My father's office. It was mostly unchanged. The same worn leather chair, the same cluttered desk, the same faint aroma of his pipe tobacco clinging to the curtains. But there were signs of Uncle Robert's presence, neatly stacked files that looked too organized, a new sleek computer monitor that felt out of place. I went straight for the filing cabinet, Financials 2023. The folder was thin, too thin. I pulled out the quarterly reports. Sales were down, way down. Expenses were up. A knot of dread tightened in my stomach. I sifted through invoices and receipts. There were payments to vendors I didn't recognize, for consulting services and marketing retainers that seemed absurdly high for a small-town hardware store. It was sloppy. It was desperate. Then I saw it shoved under a stack of catalogs on the corner of the desk, a folder from the bank. It was an application for a commercial line of credit. I scanned the pages, my light shaking slightly. They were asking for a huge amount, far more than the business could justify. And there, on the page listing assets to be used as collateral, was the line item that made my blood run cold. 100% of company shares in Henderson & Sons Hardware. They were trying to leverage the entire company, including my 51%. To do that, they needed my signature, or they needed to own the shares themselves. Hence the lowball offer, hence the vote. This was bad, but it felt like a symptom, not the disease. There was still a missing piece. Why were they in such a deep hole to begin with? I sat in my father's chair, the worn leather groaning under my weight. I looked at the desk, at the years of his life contained within it. On a hunch, I ran my fingers along the underside, just as he'd shown me when I was a kid playing hide and seek. My fingers found the small, recessed button. A false panel at the back of the deep bottom drawer popped open with a soft click. Inside was a single, thick, leather-bound ledger. This was my dad's real record book, the one he didn't keep on a computer. I opened it. It was filled with his neat, precise handwriting. It detailed years of transactions, profits, losses. As I flipped towards the more recent years, I saw a section at the back, separate from the main accounts. It was labeled simply A.H. My breath caught. A.H. Arthur Henderson, my dead uncle. The pages documented a series of large, regular withdrawals, thousands of dollars every single month for over 20 years. It was a massive, steady drain on the business, disguised under vague expense codes in the official books. My father had been bleeding the company dry for decades. But why? The last entry was in his handwriting, dated the week before he died. Then the entries continued in my Uncle Robert's much sloppier scrawl. He had taken over the payments. I flipped to the very last page in the ledger. Tucked into a paper sleeve was a bank statement. It wasn't from my family's local bank. It was from a credit union in Oregon. The statement was for a checking account, and it was recent, from just last month. It showed a direct deposit from Henderson and Sons Hardware for $5,000. My eyes scanned down the paper, past the account number, until they landed on the name printed in stark black letters. The name of the account holder. It wasn't a blind trust or a holding company. It was a person. The name was Arthur Henderson. The name on the bank statement seemed to burn itself into my retinas. Arthur Henderson. Not estate of Arthur Henderson. Not a memorial fund. A living, breathing person with an active checking account in Oregon. My uncle, the family ghost, the cautionary tale, was alive. And for the last 20 years, my father, and now my uncle, had been secretly funneling him what amounted to a fortune. The business wasn't just struggling, it was being systematically bled out. And the family, at least Robert and Carol, knew. This changed everything. The carefully constructed narrative of my family began to unravel in my mind. The story of the irresponsible drifter who died alone was a lie. Why? What had Arthur done that was so terrible they had to erase him from our history, yet so important they had to secretly support him for 2 decades? And this loan, it wasn't just to cover up Robert and Mark's mismanagement. It was to plug the massive hole left by these secret payments. They were trying to leverage my inheritance to continue funding a lie my father had started. I snapped a picture of the ledger and the bank statement with my phone, my hands trembling. This was the proof. This was the leverage. I carefully put the ledger back in its secret compartment, closed the drawer, and made the office look as though I'd never been there. As I slipped back out into the pre-dawn quiet, my rage had cooled into something harder and more precise. Steel. They had drawn a battle line, and I was no longer just defending myself. I was going on the offensive. For the next 2 days, I was a ghost. I didn't answer the single perfunctory text I received from my grandmother asking if I was okay. I let the calls from unknown numbers, likely concerned members of my team, go to voicemail. I was a man possessed. Using the information from the bank statement, I dove into the deepest corners of the internet. Arthur Henderson was a common enough name, but cross-referencing it with the Oregon Credit Union and the general age he would be, I started to find traces. A digital breadcrumb trail, a property record for a small remote cabin outside a town called Eagle Creek, a business registration for a one-man woodworking shop, A.H. Designs, a single grainy photo on the local Artisan Guild's website of a man with kind eyes and a thick, graying beard standing next to a beautifully crafted rocking chair. He had my father's eyes. The resemblance was undeniable, softened by age and what looked like a much gentler life. He wasn't the destitute drifter from the family mythology. He was an artist, a craftsman. He was alive. The plan formed in my mind, audacious and terrifying. I couldn't confront my family with this information. They would just create a new web of lies. I needed the truth, and there was only one person who could give it to me. I booked a flight to Portland, Oregon. I told my co-founder I had a family emergency, which wasn't entirely a lie. I packed a small bag, my mind a chaotic whirlwind of questions. What would I say to him? How do you introduce yourself to the uncle you thought was dead for your entire life? Would he even talk to me? What if he slammed the door in my face? What if he was part of the conspiracy? But the image of his face, the kindness in those eyes that were so like my dad's, pushed me forward. The flight felt like an eternity. With every mile that passed, I felt like I was flying further away from the person I used to be, the naive nephew, the grieving son. That person was gone, burned away in the crucible of my family's living room. When I landed in Portland, I rented the most nondescript car I could find and drove east, towards the mountains. The city gave way to suburbs, then to farmland, then to the dense towering pines of the Met Hood National Forest. The directions led me down a series of progressively smaller, less maintained roads, until I was on a gravel track that seemed more suited for a logging truck than my rented sedan. Finally, I saw it. A small hand-carved wooden sign that read, A.H. Designs. Trespassers will be offered coffee. A small plume of smoke curled from the chimney of a rustic but well-kept cabin set back from the road. A large workshop stood beside it, its doors wide open. My heart was a trip hammer in my chest. This was it. I parked the car, the engines ticking the only sound in the profound quiet of the forest. I got out, my legs feeling unsteady. I walked up the gravel path, the crunch of my footsteps seeming impossibly loud. As I got closer, I could hear the gentle scrape of a hand plane against wood. I peered into the workshop. The air smelled of cedar and sawdust. The man from the photo was there, his back to me. He was older than he looked online, his hair more white than gray, but he moved with a fluid, practiced grace. He was planing the edge of a long, beautiful piece of maple, his focus absolute. He was so engrossed in his work, he didn't hear me approach. I cleared my throat. "Excuse me," I said, my voice coming out as a croak. "Arthur Henderson?" He froze, the plane stopping mid-stroke. For a long moment, he didn't move. Then slowly, he set the tool down on his workbench and turned around. He wiped his hands on a rag, his eyes, my father's eyes, scanning me from head to toe. They were full of a weary caution, the look of a man who wasn't used to visitors. "I am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "And you are." I swallowed hard, the words catching in my throat. "My name is Alex. I'm your nephew. I'm Michael's son." The change in his expression was instantaneous and profound. The caution vanished, replaced by a storm of emotions that seemed to war for control of his face. Shock, disbelief, a deep, gut-wrenching sorrow, and then a flicker of something that looked like fear. He took a half-step back as if I were an apparition. "Michael's boy," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. "But how? They told me you all wanted nothing to do with me." "They told me you were dead," I said, the words coming out harsher than I intended. He closed his eyes for a moment, a wave of pain washing over his features. He leaned heavily against the workbench, the sawdust on his clothes stark against the dark green of his shirt. When he opened his eyes again, they were glistening. "Of course they did," he said, his voice thick with a bitterness that was decades old. "Of course they did." He looked past me, towards the road, a sudden anxiety in his gaze. "Did they send you? Does Carol know you're here?" "No," I said quickly. "No one knows. They just voted to cut me off. From everything." Arthur's face hardened, the sadness replaced by a flash of familiar, righteous anger. So the vultures are finally turning on their own, he muttered, more to himself than to me. He looked me straight in the eye, and I saw a man making a decision. Come inside, Alex. Your father was a good man, but he was a damn fool. It's time you knew the truth about the family you come from. The real truth. It started with a promise I made to your grandmother, a promise your father helped me keep, and a secret that your Aunt Carol has been trying to bury for 30 years. The inside of Arthur's cabin was a world away from the stiff, formal living room where I'd been excommunicated. It was simple, warm, and filled with the scent of wood smoke and brewing coffee. Every piece of furniture, from the sturdy kitchen table to the intricately carved bookshelf, was a masterpiece of his own making. It was a home built with hands, not just financed by a bank. He moved with a quiet efficiency, pouring 2 mugs of steaming black coffee and setting them on the table before gesturing for me to sit. For a moment, we just sat in silence, the quiet of the forest pressing in around us. He studied my face with an unnerving intensity, as if he were trying to find my father in my features. "You look like him," he finally said, his voice softer now. Around the eyes. Michael always had honest eyes. "They told me you were a drifter," I said, the words tumbling out, "that you had a fight with Grandpa, took some money, and ran away, that you couldn't handle responsibility." Arthur let out a short, bitter laugh that sounded like stones rattling in a tin can. "Oh, I handled my responsibility all right. That was the whole problem. I handled it, and Carol couldn't stand it." He took a long sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting to a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. It was an old black-and-white picture of 3 children, a stern-looking girl I recognized as a young Aunt Carol, a boy with a serious expression who was clearly my father, and a younger boy with a mischievous grin, Arthur. "It wasn't a fight with our father," he began, his voice dropping low, conspiratorial. "It was a fight with Carol, and it wasn't about the business, it was about a boy. His name was Daniel." I leaned forward, my coffee forgotten. This was uncharted territory, a hidden chapter of my family's history. Daniel was the son of one of the women who worked at the hardware store back then, Maria. She was a single mother, a wonderful woman. He was a few years younger than me, a bright, funny kid. He practically grew up in the aisles of that store. Our mother, your grandmother, Matilda, she adored him. She always wished she'd had another son, and Daniel, well, he filled a space in her heart. Our father, for all his bluster, was fond of the boy too. He was like an unofficial part of the family. Arthur's face clouded over. Carol hated it. She was always possessive. She saw Daniel as an interloper, someone stealing the attention that was rightfully hers. She was cruel to him in a way only a teenage girl can be. Little barbs, accidental shoves, things no one else would notice. But I noticed. Your father noticed. We did our best to protect him. He paused, gathering his thoughts, the memory clearly painful. The summer I turned 18, the summer before I was supposed to start college, Daniel was 16. He'd just gotten his driver's license. He was so proud. One night there was a party out by the lake. Everyone was going. Carol, your dad, me. Daniel wanted to go too, but his mother said no. He was supposed to be home helping her. Carol saw her chance, Arthur continued, his voice barely a whisper. She told him to sneak out. She told him she'd cover for him, that she'd drive him home herself. She promised. He was so desperate to fit in, to be one of us. So he went. A cold, sickening feeling began to pool in my stomach. I knew where this was going. "She got drunk," Arthur said, his words flat, devoid of emotion. "Everyone did. It was stupid. We were kids. When it was time to go, I told her I'd drive Daniel home. I was sober, but she wouldn't have it. It was her car, her plan. She was asserting her control. She got behind the wheel with Daniel in the passenger seat. Your father and I followed in his truck. We shouldn't have let her drive. We should have taken her keys. We'll regret that for the rest of our lives." He stared down into his coffee mug as if reliving the moment. She took a turn too fast. A deer ran out. She swerved, overcorrected. The car went off the road and hit a tree. It wasn't a terrible crash. Your father and I were there in seconds. Carol had a broken arm and a few cuts. But Daniel... Arthur's voice broke. He took a deep, shuddering breath before he could continue. The passenger's side took the full impact. He was gone. Instantly. The silence in the cabin was absolute. The chirping of a bird outside the window sounded like a scream. My Aunt Carol, the self-righteous matriarch, the guardian of the family legacy, had killed someone. The police came, Arthur went on, his voice a monotone of remembered trauma. Our father came. It was chaos, and in that chaos, Carol started screaming, hysterically. She told everyone. She told them I was driving. The confession landed with the force of a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs. What? She was the golden child, the perfect daughter. I was the rebellious one, the one who was always getting into trouble. It was an easy lie to believe. She cried. She put on the performance of a lifetime. My own father. He looked at me and he wanted to believe her. Protecting the family name was all that mattered. But my dad, I stammered. He was there. He knew the truth. He did, Arthur said, a flicker of warmth returning to his eyes. Michael was the only one who stood up for me. He told them what really happened, but it was his word against Carol's. Our father didn't know who to believe, and that's when your grandmother stepped in. He pointed to the photo on the mantel. Matilda knew her daughter. She knew what Carol was capable of, but she also knew what a scandal like this would do. A manslaughter charge would ruin Carol's life, tarnish the family name forever, and nothing would bring Daniel back. So she brokered a deal, a devil's bargain. To protect Carol, I would take the blame, unofficially. I would disappear. The family would put out the story that I'd had a falling out and left town. In exchange, they would support me for life. And more importantly, they would support Daniel's mother, Maria. Give her a generous pension, make sure she was taken care of for the rest of her days, without her ever knowing the real reason why. It was blood money, guilt money. My father agreed. Your dad hated it, but he went along with it to protect me from a legal battle we might not win and to honor his mother's wishes. The payments you found? Most of that money went to Maria. The rest was for me, to stay silent, to stay dead. It was all there. The secret, the shame, the reason for the lie. It was a cover-up 30 years in the making. So the business problems, I started when Maria's health began to fail a few years ago, Arthur finished for me. Her medical bills are astronomical. Your father paid them without question. But since he died, I imagine Robert and Carol aren't as willing. They see it as a burden. This loan they're trying to get isn't for the business. It's to keep the secret buried, to keep paying for Carol's sin. We sat there, the weight of his story settling between us. He had given up his life, his name, his family, all to protect the sister who had betrayed him. Why are you telling me this? I asked quietly. Arthur looked at me, and for the first time I saw a glimmer of hope in his tired eyes. Because Michael is gone. My promise of silence was to him and to my mother, your grandmother. She's not the woman she was. She's old, and she's allowed Carol to dominate her for years. And you're Michael's son. They're trying to do to you what they did to me, cut you out, take what's yours, all to feed their lies. I stayed silent for 30 years to protect this family. But what family is left to protect? It's just a nest of vipers now, and they've finally bitten one of their own. He stood up and walked over to an old roll-top desk in the corner. He unlocked it and pulled out a yellowed, brittle envelope. Your father and I wrote sworn affidavits the week after the accident, he said, his voice hard as iron. We detailed everything that happened that night, every lie Carol told. We had them notarized. He kept the original, and I kept this copy. He told me that if they ever truly turned on one of us, If they ever put the Henderson name above doing what was right, that I should use it. He slid the envelope across the table to me. He made me promise. He said, "The truth has a way of staying buried, Art. But sometimes you have to be the one to hold the shovel." I looked from the envelope to my uncle's determined face. The pieces were all there. The motive, the proof, the witness. My family thought they had exiled me. They had no idea they had just armed me. "The reunion isn't officially over until Sunday dinner tomorrow," I said, a slow, cold anger building within me. "They always have a big send-off meal at my grandmother's house." Arthur met my gaze, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He understood immediately. "It's a long drive," he said. "We should probably get started." The drive back was a surreal 20-hour marathon fueled by gas station coffee and a 30-year-old secret. Arthur and I barely spoke, but the silence wasn't empty. It was filled with a shared purpose, a strange and sudden kinship forged in the fires of my family's betrayal. I watched him out of the corner of my eye as he slept, his weathered face peaceful in the passenger seat. This was my uncle. A man who existed for me only as a ghost story, now solid and real beside me. He wasn't just a witness. He was a living, breathing testament to the rot at the core of the Henderson family. We pulled into my hometown just as the sun was beginning to set on Sunday, painting the sky in angry strokes of orange and purple. The town looked the same, but I saw it through different eyes now. The veneer of small-town respectability seemed thin, almost transparent. I could see the secrets festering beneath the surface. We drove straight to my apartment. Arthur looked around the small space, taking in the stacks of programming books and the whiteboard covered in algorithms. "Michael would have been proud of you, Alex," he said, his voice quiet. "He always wanted more for us than just the store." The words were a balm on a wound I didn't even realize was still so fresh. We had a few hours to kill before the grand finale dinner at my grandmother's house. I laid out the plan. It was simple, theatrical, and brutal. It was exactly what they deserved. Arthur listened intently, his expression grim but resolute. There was no hesitation in his eyes. He had been waiting for this day for 3 decades. While he showered and changed into a clean set of clothes I loaned him, I made a single phone call. It was to a man named Ben Carter, my father's oldest friend, and the family's longtime attorney. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose integrity was beyond reproach. I told him there was an urgent matter regarding my father's estate and the Henderson and Sons business that required his immediate presence at my grandmother's house. I told him to bring copies of my father's will and the company's incorporation documents. He sounded confused, but the urgency in my voice convinced him. We arrived at my grandmother's house just as dusk was settling. The windows glowed with a warm, inviting light, a perfect picture of familial bliss. The irony was so thick I could taste it. I parked my car down the street, out of sight. "Are you ready for this?" I asked Arthur, my hand hovering over the door handle. He looked at the house, his face a mask of stone. "I've been ready since 1993, he said. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the yellowed envelope containing his sworn affidavit. "Let's go raise the dead." We walked up the familiar stone path. I could hear the murmur of conversation and the clinking of cutlery through the open dining room window. They were all there, my executioners, enjoying their Sunday roast. I didn't bother to knock. I pushed the front door open and walked in. The conversation in the dining room stuttered and died. Every head turned towards the entryway. I stood there for a moment, letting them take in the sight of me. Aunt Carol was the first to recover. Her face, which had been flushed with wine and good cheer, tightened into a familiar mask of disapproval. "Alex, I thought we made it clear you were not welcome," she said, her voice dripping with ice. "You did," I replied, my voice calm, level. It seemed to echo in the sudden silence. "But I had to come back. I brought a guest." I stepped aside. and Arthur Henderson, the family ghost, the dead man, walked into the light of the chandelier. The effect was instantaneous and electric. It was as if I had detonated a bomb in the center of the room. My cousin Mark, who was halfway to his feet to escort me out, froze and fell back into his chair, his mouth hanging open. Uncle Robert's face went completely white, the color draining from it as if a plug had been pulled. He looked like he'd seen an actual ghost, his eyes wide with terror and disbelief. But the most telling reaction was my grandmother's. Matilda let out a choked, guttural gasp, her hand flying to her chest. Her eyes, clouded with age, were wide with a look of pure, unadulterated horror. She wasn't looking at a long-lost son. She was looking at a secret that had just clawed its way out of the grave. Aunt Carol, however, did not flinch. Her face hardened, her eyes narrowing into venomous slits. The shock on her face was quickly replaced by a wave of pure, concentrated fury. She knew exactly who he was and exactly what his presence meant. "What is the meaning of this?" she hissed, her voice shaking with rage. "What is he doing here?" "He's my uncle," I said simply, walking further into the room, Arthur at my side. We stopped at the head of the long dining table directly opposite my grandmother. I thought it was time we all had a proper family reunion. The whole family. Arthur's gaze swept over the stunned faces around the table, finally landing on his sister. "Hello, Carol," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. "It's been a long time." Just then, the doorbell rang. A look of confusion passed between Carol and Robert. I smiled. "That would be for me," I said. I went to the door and opened it to reveal a bewildered-looking Ben Carter, briefcase in hand. "Alex, what in the world is going on?" he asked, his eyes widening as he saw the scene in the dining room. "You're just in time, Ben," I said, guiding him into the room. "We're having a family meeting about the future of Henderson and Sons." I turned back to the family, my voice ringing with a newfound authority. "Now, before we get to the main event, let's clear up a few financial matters. Uncle Robert, Aunt Carol, you've been trying to get a loan from the bank using the company as collateral, haven't you? Specifically, you've been trying to leverage my 51% share without my consent, which, Ben, I believe you'll confirm, is fraud." Ben Carter's eyes darted from me to Robert, his professional demeanor kicking in. "Is this true, Robert?" Robert just stammered, unable to form a coherent sentence. "It's true," I continued, my voice cold as ice, "because the business is failing, not because of the economy or because I'm off chasing my childish fantasies, but because for 30 years this family has been funneling money out of it to pay for a secret, to pay for a crime." I looked directly at Carol. "To pay for the fact that on the night of August 14th, 1993, you got behind the wheel of a car, drunk, and killed a 16-year-old boy named Daniel Rojas." A collective, horrified gasp sucked the air from the room. My younger cousins, who had never even heard the name, looked around in confusion. Carol's face was a terrifying mottled mask of red and white. "You lie," she spat. "That's a vicious, disgusting lie. Arthur was driving." "Was he?" I asked calmly. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened the photo of my father's ledger. I placed it on the table in front of Ben Carter. "Here are the records of the payments, decades of them. Blood money, paid to keep your secret safe." Then I looked at Arthur. Arthur reached into his jacket and pulled out the yellowed envelope. He slid it across the polished surface of the dining table. It came to a stop directly in front of my grandmother. "Here is my sworn statement from that night," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of years. "And I know for a fact my brother Michael left his own statement, the original, in his safe deposit box, with instructions for it to be given to his lawyer upon his death. Isn't that right, Ben?" Ben Carter's face was pale, his mind clearly racing as he put the pieces together. He looked at the terror on Robert's face, the fury on Carol's, and the abject despair on Matilda's. He knew. "The lie is over, Carol," I said. "It's all over." My grandmother, silent until now, began to tremble violently. Her breath came in ragged, painful-sounding sobs. "No," she whispered, her eyes locked on the envelope. "No. The family... We have to protect the family." Carol slammed her hands on the table, her chair screeching back as she shot to her feet. Her eyes were wild, cornered. "This is nothing. A piece of paper. The ramblings of a drunk and a jealous boy. You have no proof." "Oh, but I think we do," a new voice said. The voice was quiet, female, and came from the hallway behind me. Every head snapped toward the sound. Standing in the doorway was a woman I'd never seen before. She was in her late 60s, with kind, dark eyes filled with a sadness so profound it seemed to have settled into the lines on her face. Beside her stood a man in his late 40s, his expression grim and resolute. My Uncle Arthur let out a choked sob. "Maria," he whispered. The woman's eyes found Carol across the room, and they burned with a cold, righteous fire that had been banked for 30 long years. "I am Maria Rojas," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the stunned silence. "Daniel was my son, and this man," she said, gesturing to the man beside her, who I now realized was a police officer in plain clothes, "is Detective Miller, my nephew. We'd like to ask you a few questions about the night my boy died." The arrival of Maria Rojas and Detective Miller shattered the last vestiges of Carol's composure. The carefully constructed fortress of lies she had lived in for 3 decades crumbled to dust in a single moment. Her face, a moment before flushed with defiant rage, turned a pasty, sickly white. She stared at Maria, the mother of the boy she'd killed, and for the first time I saw a flicker of something other than arrogance in her eyes. It was fear, pure, primal fear. "This is ridiculous," she stammered, her voice a shrill, cracking parody of its usual authority. "A private family matter. You have no right to be here. This is harassment." Detective Miller, a man with a calm, imposing presence, stepped forward. "Ma'am, Mrs. Rojas came to me a week ago with some concerns about the circumstances surrounding her son's death. She felt that the original investigation was incomplete. Your nephew's phone call this evening, along with the information he provided, has given us sufficient cause to reopen the case. We're not here to harass you. We're here to find the truth." His gaze swept the room, lingering on the terrified faces of Robert and Matilda, before settling back on Carol. "And right now, the truth seems to be in short supply in this house." Ben Carter, the lawyer, finally found his voice. He stood up, his expression a mixture of professional gravity and personal disgust. "Carol, Robert, Matilda, as your family's legal counsel, I am advising you not to say another word without a lawyer present. A different lawyer. As of this moment, I am resigning as your counsel and will be acting solely as the executor of Michael's estate." He looked at me, a new respect in his eyes, which, it seems, is going to be a far more complicated job than I imagined. My cousin Mark, who had been watching the scene unfold like a spectator at a particularly bloody tennis match, finally snapped out of his stupor. "Mom," he said, his voice a pathetic whine. "What's going on? What are they talking about?" Carol ignored him. Her eyes were locked on her mother, a silent, desperate plea passing between them. "Fix this. Make this go away." But my grandmother was a broken woman. She was staring at her 2 sons, the one she had banished and the one who had enabled a lie, and the weight of her 30-year-old decision seemed to be crushing her. The matriarch was gone, replaced by a frail old woman drowning in the consequences of her choices. I only wanted to protect you," Matilda whispered, her words directed at Carol but loud enough for the whole room to hear. "To protect the family. Protect me," Arthur's voice boomed, filled with a righteous, long-suppressed anguish. "You destroyed my life. You let her brand me a coward and a runaway. You let my own family believe I was dead. You didn't protect the family, Mother. You protected a monster and sacrificed your son to do it." Every word was a hammer blow. Matilda flinched, tears finally spilling from her eyes and tracing paths through the wrinkles on her face. Maria Rojas stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. She stopped in front of Carol, her small frame radiating a strength that dwarfed Carol's flailing panic. 30 years, Carol," she said, her voice soft but resonating with immense power. "For 30 years, you let me believe my son died because of a tragic accident with his friend. You came to his funeral. You cried. You brought me casseroles. You watched me grieve for my only child, and you never said a word." Carol recoiled as if she'd been struck. I was a child myself," she whimpered, the last pathetic defense of a cornered narcissist. "Daniel was a child too," Maria retorted, her voice hardening. "A child who trusted you. A child who is buried in the cold ground because you were selfish and reckless. My grief is not a private family matter. My son's life was not a family inconvenience to be swept under the rug. It was everything, and you took it." The detective cleared his throat. "Carol Henderson," he said, his official tone cutting through the raw emotion. "We need you to come down to the station to give a statement." It wasn't a request. Panic flared in Carol's eyes. She looked wildly around the room, at her son, her brother, her mother, searching for an escape route, a lifeline. But there were none. The faces that had once looked at her with respect and deference now regarded her with a mixture of horror, pity, and contempt. Her reign was over. 2 uniformed officers who had been waiting discreetly in the hall stepped into the room. As they approached Carol, a primal scream of pure rage and denial tore from her throat. She fought, clawing and kicking like a wild animal, her carefully maintained dignity shattering into 1,000 pieces on the fine china. My cousins gasped. My aunt's husband looked away in shame. Mark just sat there, his face buried in his hands. It was a pathetic, ugly end to a pathetic, ugly lie. They led her out, her shrieks echoing down the hallway, until the front door closed, cutting them off. A profound, ringing silence descended on the dining room. It was over. The secret was out, the ghost was real, and the queen had been dethroned. In the aftermath, the family scattered like cockroaches in the light. Robert, looking like he'd aged 20 years, mumbled something about needing to talk to his lawyer and practically ran from the house. His wife and kids followed, not even bothering to look at me. My other cousins shuffled out, avoiding eye contact, their faces pale with shock. Soon, it was just me, Arthur, Ben Carter, Maria, and my grandmother, who sat slumped in her chair at the head of the table, a solitary, broken figure. Ben Carter cleared his throat, shuffling the papers he'd brought. "Well," he said with grim understatement, "this changes things. The affidavits from both Michael and Arthur, combined with Mrs. Rojas's new testimony, are irrefutable. Carol is facing serious charges. As for the business," he looked at me, "with Robert and Carol's impending legal troubles and clear evidence of attempted fraud against a majority shareholder, their positions on the board are untenable. You, Alex, as the 51% owner and your father's named successor, are in complete control." The words hung in the air. Control. It was what they had tried so desperately to take from me, and now I had it all: the business, the truth, the power. I looked at Arthur, who gave me a small, weary nod. I looked at Maria, whose eyes were filled with a painful, tearful gratitude. And I looked at my grandmother, the architect of so much of this pain. "What happens now?" I asked, the question directed at no one in particular. Ben sighed. "Legally, a long, messy process. Personally, that's up to you. You hold all the cards, Alex. You can sell the business, dissolve it, run it yourself. You can wash your hands of this entire family and never look back. After today, no one would blame you." The thought was tempting. To just walk away. To go back to my life, my startup, and leave the wreckage of the Henderson family to rust. But then I looked at Arthur. A man who had lost 30 years. a man who deserved a chance to reclaim his name, his life. I looked at the legacy my father had tried to preserve, not just a business, but a flawed and broken family that he loved in spite of it all. And I knew what I had to do. I walked over to the dining table and picked up my phone, my fingers hovering over the contact for my co-founder. I had a choice to make, not just about a business, but about what kind of man I was going to be. Was I going to be a Henderson, defined by their secrets and lies? Or was I going to be my father's son, defined by my own choices? I made the call, my heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and exhilarating freedom. My co-founder picked up on the second ring. "Hey, it's me," I said, my voice steady. "I know this is sudden, but I need you to initiate the process to buy me out of my half of the startup, effective immediately." I paused, taking a deep breath. I've decided to come home. I have a family business to save. The decision to step away from my startup felt less like a sacrifice and more like a course correction. My co-founder was shocked, but he understood. We had built something amazing, but my path, I now realized, had forked in a way I never could have anticipated. Walking away from my own dream to save my father's wasn't a defeat. It was a choice, made freely and for the right reasons. For the first time, it felt like my legacy, not just an inheritance. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal proceedings and financial triage. Ben Carter was a godsend, helping me navigate the labyrinthine mess my aunt and uncle had created. With Carol facing manslaughter charges and Robert implicated in the cover-up and fraud, their shares in Henderson & Sons were frozen as assets. I used my clear majority to call an emergency board meeting, which consisted of me, Ben, and a very silent, shell-shocked Uncle Robert, and formally removed both him and Carol from their positions. I was now the sole, undisputed head of Henderson & Sons Hardware. The first thing I did was call a meeting with the store's employees. They were nervous, having heard the rumors swirling around town. I laid it all out for them. The financial trouble, the mismanagement, but not the dark family secrets. I told them the truth, that we were in a deep hole, but that I was committed to digging us out. I promised them their jobs were safe, that we were going to modernize, adapt, and bring the store my great-grandfather founded into the 21st century. Looking at their relieved faces, I felt the first real spark of hope. My second act as CEO was to drive out to Arthur's cabin in Oregon. He was packing up his workshop, preparing to come home for good. I sat with him at his handmade kitchen table and made him an offer. "I need a partner," I told him. "Someone who knows this business. Someone who understands what it means to build things with your own hands. More than that, I need family I can trust." I offered him a senior position, a full partnership, and a salary that reflected 30 years of back pay. He tried to refuse, but I insisted. "This is your legacy too, Uncle Arthur," I said. "It's time you came home and claimed it." The look of gratitude in his eyes was worth more than any tech company valuation. The legal battle with Carol was ugly and public. She hired a team of expensive lawyers who tried to paint Arthur as an opportunist and me as a vengeful usurper. But the evidence, the affidavits, the financial records, Maria's powerful testimony was overwhelming. In the end, faced with a mountain of proof, she took a plea deal. She was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter and fraud, sentenced to a significant prison term. Her fall from grace was complete and absolute. Mark, her golden boy, was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life, his inheritance swallowed by legal fees. Robert, in exchange for his testimony against his sister, received a lighter sentence of probation and community service for his role in the financial fraud. He sold his shares back to the company for a pittance to cover his own legal costs and left town, a shamed and broken man. Through it all, my grandmother remained in her house, a ghost haunting the halls of her own making. I visited her once. She looked small and frail, lost in the cavernous, silent home. She tried to apologize, to explain her choices, but the words felt hollow. I didn't yell, I didn't rage. I simply told her, "You chose a version of the family that was easier to look at, not the one that was real, We're going to try and build a real one now." I continued to ensure she was cared for, but the warmth, the bond we once had, was gone. Another casualty of the 30-year lie. Arthur and I poured our souls into revitalizing the hardware store. We launched a new website with an online inventory. We started offering workshops, teaching woodworking and home repair, with Arthur as the lead instructor. He was a natural, patient, and kind, his passion for his craft infectious. The community, initially drawn in by the scandal, stayed for the quality and the genuine sense of purpose the new Henderson & Sons exuded. We didn't just sell tools, we helped people build things. Slowly, painstakingly, we began to turn a profit. We paid off the debts and established a new line of credit, this time based on sound financials and a solid business plan. One of our first official acts as partners was to establish the Daniel Rojas Memorial Scholarship, a fund bankrolled by the company to help underprivileged kids in our community attend trade schools. Maria was on the board of directors. At the first awards ceremony, she stood beside me and Arthur, and I saw her smile, a genuine, hopeful smile for the first time. The blood money that had sustained a lie for 30 years was finally being used to build futures. It wasn't justice, not really. Nothing could bring her son back, but it was a form of grace. A year after that fateful reunion, the family gathered again. This time, it wasn't at my grandmother's house. It was a barbecue in the back lot of the hardware store, surrounded by lumber racks and bags of concrete. It was a smaller group. It was just me, Arthur, and a few of our more distant cousins who had reached out, horrified by Carol's actions and wanting to reconnect. Maria was there too, an honorary and essential member of our new patchwork family. We grilled burgers, talked about the business, and laughed. The air wasn't thick with resentment. It was clear and smelled of sawdust and possibility. As the sun began to set, Arthur clapped me on the shoulder. He looked around at the bustling store, at the happy faces of our employees and family, his eyes glistening. "Your father would be so damn proud of you, Alex," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't just save his legacy, you made it better. You made it honest." I looked at the sign above the door, Henderson & Sons Hardware. The name was the same, but it meant something different now. It was no longer a monument to a buried secret. It was a testament to the truth, a business rebuilt on a foundation not of lies, but of integrity, forgiveness, and the enduring strength of a family that had been through hell and found its way back into the light. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my old startup partner, with a link to an article about their latest success. I smiled, genuinely happy for them. I hadn't lost a dream. I had just found the one that truly mattered. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt like I was finally home.